Live from 5 News, this is Breaking News.
And welcome and thank you for joining us on this special edition on 5 News Plus with some breaking news. Jacob Luthi here, Bo Russell. We had just witnessed Andrew McGann appearing in court today here at the Washington County Courthouse. This is about 3 months after he was first arraigned at the Washington County Detention Center. Again, that was 3 months ago, about August 14th. Back in court today. It was a pre-trial hearing to kind of discuss the status of this case, to figure out where we're at right now. Let's talk a little bit about just from your perspective, Bo, about what you saw inside the courtroom today. What stood out? What did you notice?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I noticed was how packed it was, right? Mm-hmm. I go to a lot of court cases. Usually there's a small crowd for bigger cases, but this was standing room, right? There were people standing to watch. It was extremely packed. It also started pretty late. It was set to start at 8 o'clock. They started around 8:25. So I was noticing that. Also noticing just the demeanor. Everyone was a little on edge, right? Mm-hmm. This is the first time that Andrew McGann made an appearance in court where people could actually be present and watch, and I was nervous. I think there was nervousness in the room. We've heard a lot, and again, Andrew McGann, alleged suspect in this case, innocent until proven guilty, but there was a sense of uncertainty about what was going to happen today. At least that's what I felt. Yeah. Did you get a similar sense?
Yeah, and just for those at home who may be unfamiliar with this case, right? Andrew McGann is accused of killing Clinton and Kristen Brink at Devil's Den State Park back on January 26th of this year. He was found on July 30th at a beauty salon in Springdale. He's facing 2 counts of capital murder. The prosecution is seeking the death penalty. Now we know that earlier and let's talk about a little bit about what he wore, right? Earlier, or a couple weeks ago, the prosecution or the defense had asked that McGann appear in court in civilian clothing without visible restraints. From what we saw, that's what it was. I mean, we saw him walking in. He was in a white button-up T-shirt. He was in a red tie. He had brown khakis on. That's what we expected, right? That's kind of what the judge had granted. Again, defense thinks that he might be prejudiced if there were potential jurors watching, seeing him in that orange garb. They might assume guilt. That's the reason why defense counsel does this. So, again, that's what he was wearing in court today. They heard 19. There were 19 motions that they filed this week. About 4 were granted, relating about disclosure of files. But again, not anything regarding what the sentencing, about the death penalty. That will all be discussed in the spring.
Right, yeah, they did address a few motions, and there was no objection to those by the prosecution that the defense raised. I do want to mention Andrew McGann's demeanor a little bit. We've heard a lot of things. I think we've all kind of made certain assumptions just by the nature of this case. He was very calm. His voice, not exactly what I was expecting, kind of a very quiet, soft voice. So I was surprised by his demeanor in that sense. And then going back to what you were saying about the motions filed, I talked to Prosecutor Brandon Carter after the case. We talked about what hearings are going to look like moving forward. A motion that was not mentioned today was the defense's motion to take the death penalty out of this case. Mm-hmm. Well, I talked to Brandon Carter. He said they still have every intention of pursuing the death penalty in this case, but he also mentioned it's going to take years, right? And I think today we really felt that. Mm-hmm. The courtroom was full. It was full of people. Again, standing room only. Everyone was expecting something. It really wasn't much. It was really just kind of, here's where we're at. Here's what we're going to be doing moving forward. And as Brandon Carter said, there's going to be probably close to 50 of these hearings before it ever goes to trial. Yeah. So we're looking at years down the road before we ever get to trial.
Which is crazy to think about in a case this big, right? Taking this long to go to trial, but that tells you how much information that they're going to be sifting through, how many records they're going to be sifting through. All of that information is still going to be going on. And, it just was interesting. I spoke to a defense attorney who talked a little bit about these pretrial motions, saying most of this is all standard. And a lot of the times defense counsel has to do this because if there is a conviction, if this does go to a sentencing phase, if he does get, if the jury does, or the judge does give him the death penalty, you're going to want to make sure the defense counsel is that they filed all these motions pre-trial so that if again, like I said, if it goes to that sentencing phase, if it goes to that death penalty phase, it's going to go to appeals. And so they want to be able to say that they covered the rights of their defendant, that they covered their client's rights.
Well, and I think, that's not just a prerogative that defense attorneys have, I think Judge Joanna Taylor is also taking enormous steps to ensure that this trial, the hearings, everything happens above board, right? Following procedure. Today, a little bit interesting, Andrew McGann, when he was brought in, we were waiting with cameras, hoping to get a first look at him as he came in. Kind of tricked a little bit, right?
Yeah,
you were here for that?
A little bit of a decoy. So where we thought he was going to be brought in, there was a sheriff's car that came into the driveway. Kind of, all the officers kind of came towards that area. You had me and our photographer Will here. You had other photographers from other stations here, already with our cameras, and they pulled back, and all of a sudden they get a thumbs up from another officer, and the car drives away.
Right.
So we were like, well, did we just get decoyed? And it turns out we did. They actually brought McGann through a side of the building from one of the officers. They said that is because of the judge. And again, like you just mentioned, maybe trying to cover all these bases, maybe trying to make sure that there is not a potential juror out there that's maybe watching that sees him and maybe assumes guilt. And so again, covering all these bases, but very interesting day in court today for sure. Just like I said, you were there that day of where we got the call that the suspected killings had happened. You showed up to Devil's Den State Park. Having been there on the ground that day, but having been here, kind of talk about that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been, I feel very connected to this case, right? I was actually coming back from Oklahoma covering a different story. We got a tip that police had been called to Devil's Den. I was driving past, might as well go check it out. It's on the way back. So I get there, and it was apparent immediately that something big had happened, a large police presence. And throughout the rest of that week, as the manhunt went on for Andrew McGann, it was this sense of not knowing, what happened, who did this, right? And again, Andrew McGann's still the alleged suspect in this case. But seeing him here today, it is a little bit of a retrospective of everything up to this point. Everything from here out is all it's all attorney work. It's all the evidence has been collected. And so that phase of the investigation is over, and at least as far as we know. So today, seeing him in court, seeing all this taking place, it does take a little bit of the urgency off and kind of go towards, again, what we were talking about with Brandon Carter saying that this is going to take years, that today really did kind of put a cap on that manhunt, even though he's been in custody for months now. Seeing him in court, it's like, okay, we have a suspect, now we can move forward with this case.
And let's talk a little bit about this case. If we have any video of kind of that when we were there at Devil's Den State Park on that day, let's talk a little bit about the history of this case. Now, again, McGann is accused of killing Kristen and Clinton Brink at Devil's Den State Park on July 26th. They say the couple was hiking with their two daughters when they were attacked. The two girls, aged 7 and 9, we were told by police, are now safe. They are with their family. This sparked a multi-day manhunt. I mean, we had state, federal, local. We had every agency you can think of here looking for this man, and not a lot of information. That's one of the things that we had talked about a lot early on in this manhunt, was the amount of information being shared with us. They ended up telling us later on that the lack of release of information had a lot with not wanting to spook him, not wanting him to run away, maybe go somewhere, and maybe it worked because look, he was found on July 30th at a barbershop in Springdale. He was getting a haircut. Right. He felt comfortable enough to be outside to go show himself at a haircut. That is where police found him. We have video of when he got apprehended too.
And I want to touch on that a little bit. The police, a lot is going to come out as we learn more in these hearings. I'm hearing every time I go and talk to a sheriff in a different county, they're all talking about how they followed this case and all the different methods that could have been used. And it's one of those things, we hear about the U.S. military, right? It's probably 30 years ahead of where we think it's at. Same thing here with police work, detective work. They probably used methods that we don't even know about yet because this manhunt was, when you think about it, really done in such a short time, only 5-6 days until they found this suspect who, like you said, found in a barbershop, seemingly thought he might have gotten away with it.
Yeah, and it's just interesting, like you said, like I had mentioned a second ago, not wanting to spook him. I mean, the pictures that we got were of, I remember, it was the one of his backpack in the very, there was no sign of, we had the drawing and we had that picture. Right. No distinct visual information of maybe what he looked like. So again, they were very specific about what information they released. Now, they found him again on July 5th at the barbershop. Now that there's a preliminary report that investigator noticed wounds on his hand as well as blood located inside of the vehicle. McGann first appeared in front of a judge on August 1st, where he was formally read his rights, appointed his attorney, and then arraigned 2 weeks later. That was the arraignment that we were not allowed, the media was not allowed into. But a little bit about touching on the fact that what was it that night or the day after they found him? You have the governor, you have the Arkansas State Police Director, Mike Hagar, you have Arkansas State Parks Director, Secretary as well, all showing up in front of the camera and saying, we have our guy.
Absolutely.
There has, from hearing from defense counsel, there has to be something definitive or something that where they believe they absolutely have their guy. To have the governor and all these people standing up in front of the entire state, in front of the entire country, this is a national story, saying, we have our guy, this is him, he's in custody. Maybe to put a lot of minds at ease, maybe to put a lot of people at ease. I know there was a lot of unease happening in the state, but maybe they believe they have their guy.
Absolutely. Well, today Brandon Carter, he commented he can't say anything about the evidence that they have right now, but prior to the gag order, he said we are very confident that we have our suspect in this case. So they have evidence pointing towards Andrew McGann being the suspect in this case, and again, he's innocent until proven guilty, but they definitely feel confident that they have caught their suspect. And you mentioned Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders coming up to Northwest Arkansas to make that announcement. Yep. I think that really goes to show just how much this case impacted people. It's such a tragic story. Children were there when it happened, involved in this case. And I also think it shows how resilient this community is, coming around those children with the GoFundMe, making sure that they're safe. And so, it's a very sad story, but we really have seen the best in the community and law enforcement, in, attorneys, judges. A lot of good is coming around.
Yeah, and you think about that too, about they got thousands of tips, whether that's people calling in saying, hey, I think I saw this person, or whether that's video that maybe someone was taking a selfie and maybe they were in the background, right? They got thousands of tips from the entire community during this time. They said that was instrumental in them being able to apprehend him. So like you mentioned with the community there, but again, kind of just recapping a little bit about what happened, right? This was a pretrial hearing. We had 19 motions that defense filed this week. A few of them were heard relating to the disclosure of some documents. They're talking a little bit about when prosecution has to respond to some pretrial motions later on when we get to those. And whether it comes to kind of rough notes or stuff, really procedural. Brandon Carter as well, just saying, this is all stuff we're expecting. Right. We don't have a response to this. We don't have an objection to these types of motions. In the spring is when we're probably going to start seeing some objections by the prosecution, some response of, we don't want to take certain things off. We want this there. So again, the judge had asked in court today, they had asked that, they figure out a time in the spring to have to have hearings on these motions. Like you said, we are still so early into this case right now. And then the next court date was set for January 15th of 2026. Again, a pretrial hearing, status hearing. Where are we in this case? What new information do we need to share with people? Do you have any last thoughts about what we saw in the courtroom today, about kind of just this case in general?
Yeah, I just think what we saw today was there's a great interest in this. People really are. There were people in the courtroom who had nothing to do with this case, who just came to watch. So I think this really has the public's attention, and because of that, we're going to be on top of it. We're going to be here for the hearings. We're going to get all the updates because it's important. It's important to know what's going on, for accountability, for understanding. So yeah, we're going to be here next hearing January 15th.
Yeah, and I think another thing about what's specific to this case, specific to today, that's so interesting was the fact that we saw him for that long on camera.
Yeah.
That's something that, when at the trial or at the hearing at the detention center, there's video of him from the back. There's, that camera of him from above.
TV screen, yeah.
TV screens, you don't get to see his facial expressions. You don't get to see his reactions. That is something that we saw him in court today, both inside the courtroom as well as walking out of that courtroom. Again, following all developments, we'll be following it on 5newsonline.com, following it right here on 5+, as well as our linear channels as well on television. But for Bo Russell, I'm Jacob Luthi. This has been a special edition of 5 News. We'll go ahead and send it back